Thank you for joining us on Speaking Freely. We're titling today's episode, Who Stands on Guard for Thee? Drug Safety and the Role of Experts. The story will weave together a historical incident that affected tens of thousands of people worldwide, the thalidomide scandal, in which expectant mothers were given a drug to deal with the effects of morning sickness. Unfortunately, that drug led to miscarriages and birth defects in the children of pregnant women. Those thalidomide babies are now in their late 50s and early 60s in Canada and abroad. But here's the real interesting Canadian connection to all that. In 1960, a young researcher working at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, saw the data that the drug manufacturer of thalidomide had handed to the agency, and she said something isn't right. She blocked approval for the drug, and as a result, saved hundreds of thousands of Americans from the side effects of the drug. A woman named Frances Oldham Kelsey, and she was a Canadian, born in BC on Vancouver Island. A graduate of McGill University, in 1962, she was given the Presidential Medal of Honor by John F. Kennedy. That medal was timed to save Frances Kelsey from the pressure and bullying she was facing from the drug manufacturer, who wanted, naturally, to have thalidomide approved on the US market as it was being sold in Canada and in Europe. Our story then shifts to the present and a modern-day Canadian hero who was the subject of a novel and later a movie called The Constant Gardener. The novel was written by the late John le Carré and was based on the harrowing story of Dr. Nancy Olivieri. Dr. Nancy Olivieri is a professor of medicine at the University of Toronto, and in the early 1990s, she was testing a drug that she had a hand in co-developing called deferiprone. Dr. Olivieri was an expert in blood diseases, and this drug was being developed to help those persons that were dealing with hemoglobin issues in patients suffering from this rare blood disorder. However, it was in the course of those drug trials that Dr. Olivieri started to question the efficacy and, more importantly, the safety of the drug that she had co-developed. Her story is a touchstone for anyone who thinks that the horrors of the thalidomide scandal could never occur again. So today's episode weaves together these two stories and talks to a survivor of thalidomide who has gone on to become an inspiration to thousands in this country and abroad. Born without arms, and initially not even knowing that he was a thalidomide survivor, he has gone on to play drums, write books, and inspire thousands with his story.
Do you know, that is just an attitude choice. There's always something you can do. If you can't excel at something, why even bother to try and do it? Well, I guess if you're looking for Olympic gold, that's one kind of attitude to have. But what about the idea that not everybody needs to win a gold medal to be successful? Celebrate who you are, because you deserve it. And while we're at it, make sure you learn a couple of things while you're here. Because there's a lot of people that believe in certain things, like that lady in the kitchen. You know what? I got pretty short toes. She wasn't wrong. It just occurred to me one day, maybe I should have got a second opinion.
There's a lot of you in the building today. No, you are. You're happy people. I've been seeing you. Do you ever occur to you that when you're that happy, people want to smack you? Imagine my frustration. I've got no arms. All I can do is be resentful. Anyway,
I am on the entire front cover of the newspaper, bigger than life, almost nude. Wearing a diaper, yes, but a black photographic bar across my eyes so nobody will recognize who I am.
really? You ever done this? Sorry, this is really honest. You ever spot a baby in a stroller? And you go look at the baby in the stroller, and your first thought is, man, that's an ugly baby. You've done that, haven't you? But my 2 cents is really quite simple. I believe who we are is not what people see when we first meet. I believe who we are is deeper than that. In fact, I have hands, they're right here. And I believe when that happened, my so-called handicap disappeared.
Finally, we will talk with someone, Dr. David Healey, professor at McMaster University, who has studied historical and modern-day drug trials, and how little we actually know as the general public, and even as regulators, about the actual people who form part of these trials and what happens to them and to the data that is used. So join us after the break when we'll be speaking to Alvin Law, thalidomide survivor, Dr. Nancy Olivieri, and Dr. David Healey, as we find out who stands on guard for our health and safety in the real world of drug trials. Welcome back to Speaking Freely. On today's show, we're going to have three guests that are going to be speaking to us about drug safety, the history of thalidomide, and what effect it had. And we're going to start with one person who has a very personal journey and a personal story associated with thalidomide. His name is Alvin Law. He's joining us from Calgary. And I want Alvin to, maybe you can inform the viewers just about your story and how it came to be that you were one of Canada's thalidomide generation. Maybe tell us a bit about that story.
Sure, Rafael, it's a pleasure to be here. I thank you for doing this. I love the title, Speak Freely. I'm a professional speaker by trade. That was never my plan because I was born without arms. And I was actually one of the first Canadian thalidomide victims or survivors or whatever appropriate title you would be most comfortable with. Frankly, I've never subscribed to labels, but the reality is I was born in a town called Yorkton, Saskatchewan in the summer of 1960. And then I was very quickly given up for adoption. So at 5 days of age, I was homeless. And 2 weeks later, I was taken to a foster home with a 55 and 53-year-old couple named Hilda and Jack Law. They were going to keep me for a couple of weeks, and they kept me forever. So they taught me not only to use my feet, which is actually quite common amongst people who do not have arms, at least the ones that are born that way. And I not only became a successful foot user, but I also, I think, believe that I became a very successful human being, in fact, because I was born without arms and I've had a very good life. I can't imagine what it would have been like to go home with the people that didn't want me, but I consider myself very lucky to have been raised in a home that did.
Now, for the appreciation of our viewers who might not have an understanding of how it came to be that you were born without arms, can you tell us a little bit about the thalidomide itself and what role it played in your birth and in your life?
You bet. And I want to make it very clear that I am not an expert on this other than the fact that I have done an awful lot of research just of my own curiosity. Fascinatingly, I did not know that I was, in fact, a thalidomide survivor until I was well into my late 20s, when I was actually asked to join and form a group called the Thalidomide Victims Association of Canada. Met some very expert doctors because, you see, I was adopted. I did not have any medical files that were able to confirm that until, again, in my early 30s, I was able to meet my birth mother, who was the one that gave me away. So I was raised with the understanding that I was born without arms. We didn't talk about it. Thalidomide was not mainstream media like it is today in terms of internet, although there were sort of stories that floated around. People would ask my mom if I was, and my mom had a great answer. She didn't care what happened to me. All she cared about was going to happen. So I didn't have an awful lot of knowledge, but my understanding as I've gained knowledge is the medication basically affected my limb development, and it affected each and every thalidomide survivor in its own unique way. Some are missing just a finger. Others that I've met have been missing all four of their limbs. So it was really very particular to each human being. And from what I understand, during which part of the first trimester it was taken. And the really uncomfortable part of the story is not every woman that took thalidomide who was pregnant had a deformed baby, which the evil company Grunenthal tried to use in its defense. They're really the bad part of this story. I think if I ever get to that point in this interview of talking about them, I won't talk very nicely because I do not believe they did their job in terms of their moral implications, the ethical implications. They used the excuse that it was the time, we didn't have rules. I hate excuses, but I also don't really like to blame. So there we are.
Well, I like that mix of honesty, but also positivity that you have brought to the thalidomide story and to the community here in Canada. I found out about you actually by reading a National Post story this past year, I think on the anniversary of a woman named Frances Oldham Kelsey, who in the US was only months into her role and was designed to approve or not approve drugs. And she came across this drug, thalidomide, and she said no based on what she saw. How is it that, you mentioned the company that produced this, how is it that in Canada we actually gave this to expectant mothers, and what was the ostensible purpose of pregnant women taking this drug?
Well, there's a lot of long stories about this, and I'll keep it brief.
Sure.
But the history of this drug, quite frankly, is very, very dark. It was actually theoretically created at Auschwitz and some of the death camps by Nazi SS scientists who were using it as a sedative to give to the people they were about to end the lives of. That's a very dark and cryptic thing to say, but that's factual.
Yeah.
They went on, these scientists didn't get charged with war crimes. They actually escaped. They formed the company Grunenthal. They invented thalidomide because it was a sedative, but it was supposed to be a safe sedative. But let's not forget, we didn't know what we know now about pharmaceutical safety. In those days, you didn't even have to get it through the system. All you had to do was make it, do some investigation by giving it to people. It was literally, take these 2 pills and call me and tell me what happened. Right. Literally like that. Yeah. So I'm not to let them off the hook, but the reality was we also didn't know what we know about pharmaceuticals then. We know now that women shouldn't take drugs when they're pregnant, but we didn't know it then. And because it was for morning sickness, it was viewed as a compassionate drug. But of course, they didn't bother checking whether it affected the unborn babies, which it indeed did do. And I think the bottom line to this is we weren't the only victims, us people that were born without limbs. So were the moms. Yeah. I've always viewed the moms as the victims. But You're right. Dr. Kelsey was indeed a hero. If I may be very blunt, the Americans generally tend to be addicted to pharmaceuticals. It's just part of their nature. So if that drug would have been allowed in their country, we could have seen hundreds of thousands of birth defects. That's why Florence Kelsey is indeed a true hero.
Yeah, and she's Canadian to boot, which is another...
Yeah, if I may interject, I was actually lucky to speak at her school named after her on Vancouver Island just this past fall. Dr. Florence Kelsey, Senior Secondary High School. What a thrill. And of course, to tell them the story, they'd heard it, again, from sort of different points of view, but to actually meet somebody that was profoundly connected to her life story, it was quite moving to watch the audience feel the effect of a true hero, not only in Canada, but definitely up in that part of the world of Vancouver Island.
So just to be clear, this is a elementary school or a high school?
A high school in Cobble Hill, British Columbia, her hometown.
Well, we're going to get to your story again before we end this program. Talk more about how you made your life story an inspirational one. But I think just that last part of kind of the next generation learning some of the lessons of thalidomide, I think is so important.
Extremely. And if you weren't doing this, they probably would let these memories fade into the distance, just like so many things from our past. And I'd be happy to join you again soon.
Great. So we don't want these memories to be lost. So part of our story here is how the same kind of thalidomide scandal of the 1960s has reoccurred in different forms. So we're going to take a look at drug safety in Canada from 2 experts just after the break. Welcome back to Speaking Freely. We're now going to talk to 2 distinguished academics who have made it their life's work to look into the safety of the pharmaceuticals that we as Canadians take and are given. I'm going to start with Dr. Nancy Olivieri, who in the 1990s became well known for a drug known as deferriprone. And there was a lot of research surrounding this particular drug that Nancy uncovered that made her question its, not just its efficacy, but more importantly, its safety. So Nancy, do you mind telling us a little bit about that story and also your background and how it came to be that you were on the front lines of, again, trying to stop a drug that could have harmed many, many people?
Sure, I will. I'm pleased to be here to talk about this. Well, I actually was a hematologist, a younger hematologist at the Hospital for Sick Children. And I was involved in a disease called thalassemia, which is actually one of the most common single gene disorders in the world. And we wanted a better treatment. I won't describe the previous treatment, but we wanted a simpler treatment. So I didn't delve into these studies. I started these studies, and I actually asked the University of Toronto at Lashmiller Laboratories to make the drug. I read about it in the BMJ. The Brits didn't want to collaborate with me, so we made it ourselves. We encapsulated it. We got Health Canada to approve it. We got Medical Research Council funding, and we started to do the trials. And the trials looked extremely promising, and they were actually published in a prestigious journal around 1995. And around that time, my right hand and I, my colleague at Columbia University in New York, and I looked at the data and realized the data were quite concerning because the primary endpoint of the trial was not being reached. It was, in fact, liver iron concentration in patients who are transfused. Iron is toxic to the body. And if the iron goes too far up, you'll get diabetes, heart disease, and liver disease. We both concluded that after the promising start, it wasn't sufficiently effective. And by that time, our publicly funded trials had been supplemented by funding from the late Barry Sherman of Apotex. And we raised concerns, and he then threatened me with all legal remedies should I inform the parents or the patients, a lot of these people were kids, or publish my concerns. And I did both, but what I hadn't realized was that just that summer, the University of Toronto had begun negotiations for the largest donation in its history from Barry Sherman. And this would be a story about pharma and pharma badness, except that it's really a story about pharma and academia, because immediately senior administrators at the university and Sick Kids Hospital, where the controversy arose, began to take actions harmful to me with firings and public accusations, punitive financial actions. And Sherman kept threatening and then finally made good on those threats. And we had 2 decades of litigation.
Now, at that point, when the kind of firestorm started and centered on you rather than the drug, was this drug out in the market and was it being prescribed?
No. These were early trials, and we had been charged, my colleague, Dr. Britnam, and I had been charged with 2 of the trials, the only trials in the world looking at quantitative liver iron. And we were also co-chairs of the scientific committee of the safety trial, which the FDA had said we needed. We'd gone to the FDA in 1991, and they'd said, you got to do a trial in Europe, needing 200 patients. So we supervised that. We set it up. We knew every patient that was enrolled. But then Sherman fired me, Gary Britnam resigned in protest, and it was given to other compliant doctors. It was by no means close to licensing. But then when I was in Australia in 98, I got a brown envelope that said they're trying to get it licensed in Europe. So I brought a case against the licensor against Apotex at the European Court of Justice, and it was heard. It was thrown out on standing, not merits. It's a very big, dramatic 4 years of what Sherman told the European Court was that I was an incompetent scientist who had been fraudulent with the data. And that was believed. It was not believed 10 years later when he alleged that to the FDA, because the FDA then came up and did the very rare inspection that they almost never do inspections, and they almost never do them in foreign countries. So it's a long story of how, and I'm sure David will address this, how regulatory bodies are captured. But no, it wasn't close to being licensed at that point. But what was feared, at least I want to be careful here, some were led to speculate that the conflict erupted at the University of Toronto because the administrators wanted to be very careful not to offend Barry Sherman.
So before I bring in David on this, just to be clear, your work started by trying to trial this drug.
Oh yeah, I was
to look at the efficacy.
Yeah.
But in point of fact, when you saw the endpoints and the results, you were saying, no, this is not going to go to market and shouldn't.
Well, we knew it. We knew it was too high, the liver irons. Mm-hmm.
And did your work and all the tribulations and trials you went through actually prevent this drug from actually being administered?
Oh, no. It was licensed in Europe. They wanted first line. They got third line. Well, it was second line at the time. Now there are 2 licensed first line drugs. The FDA was told I was an incompetent, fraudulent scientist, but they came up to do an inspection. And in that inspection, they realized, well, this is not the case. I mean, the data that we were given omitted nearly 40% of the data. In other words, Sherman had given them data, but not all that data were correct. David and I have talked about this, and he says that mine was one of the last trials ever to have the data there, because I had the data. I had the CRFs, the clinical research forms, in my hand untouched. So Barry Sherman stopped the trials in 96, but I'd saved those CRFs for 13 years untouched in my office. So when the FDA came and said, "You're a big fraudulent scientist, according to Sherman," I said, "No, I'm not. And here are the CRFs to show it." And they went back and stopped. I want to say this because it's important. They stopped the advisory committee on that. And for 2 years, they asked Sherman to do another trial since he had stopped mine. And he refused. And then the FDA caved and gave it third line status, what the Cochrane refers to as last resort status.
I see. So third line means a drug of last resort if other things have failed. I'm going to come back to you, Nancy, but I wanted to bring in Professor Healey in. Because I know his work, as you alluded to, has looked into this whole question of trials and access to data. David, can you just tell us a little bit about how drug trials actually work? I think there's a perception, probably amongst the public, that since the thalidomide scandal, Health Canada and the FDA in the US has access to actually this data that is done in the clinical trials. But that's not the case, is it?
No, it's not. And let me make 2 or 3 quick points first. As Alvin said, back in 1962, when drugs were being brought on the market first, people didn't do clinical trials. One of the consequences of the thalidomide crisis was we thought, look, we really have to show that these drugs work. And the way to show they work was to do a randomized control trial, an RCT. Now, when people ran RCTs during the 1960s, 1970s, the expectation was that they were doing science. That is, if things happened in the course of the trial, let's say, for instance, in the course of the vaccine trials we have now, let's say a person got a heart attack shortly after they'd just received the vaccine dose. The expectation was the doctors and the scientists would look closely into it and try and work out, well, was there a link between the vaccine and what had happened to the person that they'd just had a heart attack? The problem is, slowly over a period of time, these trials, which were the way pharmaceutical companies got their drug on the market, became a business exercise rather than an exercise in any kind of science. So if you have a heart attack in the vaccine trial, as I've found out, interviewing people who've had heart attacks in vaccine trials, what happens is the businessmen that now run the trials don't really investigate what's actually happened, trying to work out, is the vaccine causing this? They make it disappear. They write it out of the script. So the reports that go to FDA and to Health Canada don't contain the details about what actually happened. And what you've got in the case of the trial Nancy did, you've got the person there doing the trial with a drug that she was hoping to bring on the market, a drug that she had effectively discovered. So she had huge incentive to try and make this work. But rather than try and look at what was going to be good for her, she was concerned about the problems that began to appear on the drug. So she was clearly doing science, and Barry Sherman was doing business. We want to make the problems disappear so we can make money. Now, I think in the case of Nancy, what you're looking at is a heroine who really ought to be celebrated even more than Frances Kelsey, because she's had to endure huge problems that have been ongoing for 30 years.
Well, David, I want to stop you there, and after the break, I want to come back to that journey and that story that Nancy's had to endure. And you're right, the kind of heroine aspect of her work, her heroic work, I think more Canadians need to know about it. So thank you very much. Join us after the break, and we'll hear more about Nancy's journey. Thank you for joining us again on Speaking Freely. When we left off, we were just about to get into the journey that Professor Nancy Olivieri faced after she decided to not approve, in her words, this drug that had some pretty concerning endpoints, deferiprone, which was meant to sort of help alleviate blood disorders. And Nancy, what in fact happened on that journey, and how did it sort of resolve itself, if at all?
Well, David has a fantastic piece in which he highlights that it didn't resolve itself. But let me start by saying we raised issues to the Research Ethics Board. They were probably the last people in authority to act appropriately and said, well, you got to inform the patients. Barry Sherman, on the other hand, had slipped a note under my door saying, if you do inform the patients, you'll be served with all legal remedies. And I will keep that up. He did, in fact, keep it up for 19 years. Lawsuits, slap lawsuits, lots of discovery, spent many, many summers in legal discovery. But just to go back, there was panic at the University of Toronto Faculty of Medicine because they were anticipating this large donation. And of course, we were in the dark about that for a long time. So there was harassment, there was firing. There were 4 colleagues of mine at the Hospital for Sick Children who pretty much gave up their lives for 20 years to support me. And they too were harassed, received punitive financial actions. They were targeted. It's a long, terrible story of bullying as well as pharma bullying. And then what happened was I was referred to the college. Anybody thinks hospital ethicists do anything, here's the answer: they don't, because the 2 hospital ethicists that were called in were essentially they implemented the sending of myself to the College of Physicians and Surgeons in an effort to remove my medical license. Unfortunately, the college took 1.5 years to look at this and then said, no, her conduct was commendable. We're not rescinding her license. The hospital stopped posting the report that had sent me that on their website. They took it down. They didn't appeal. And then the Canadian Association of University Teachers, as well as the University of Toronto Faculty Association, who had been involved throughout, produced a report. It took 2.5 years from 3 unpaid academics. And they detailed what was called the Olivieri report for the first 5 years. And that was kind of a nail in the coffin to a lot of the gossip and the rumors and the whisper campaign. It didn't bring it to an end because there were a lot of efforts, and I spent a lot of time suing media. I won't illuminate for you the particular media that I sued, but there was a lot of compliant media. They generally side with Goliath. You had a university president who has been known as the boy of corporate Canada. So he was not going to help. He brought in $1 billion during his tenure with approaches like this. Then we go to the regulatory aspects of things. We went to the European Court of Justice in 1999, but we were thrown out on standing, not merits. So we had no real way to stop that being licensed in Europe. When the FDA 10 years later was told about my apparent fraud, they disproved that. That was they did come up for an inspection and showed, no, that wasn't the case, but they still backed down and licensed the drug as last resort. And then in the last 10 years, I was dismissed from my position at the University Health Network, which was head of research in hemoglobinopathies, by the division chief who said, corporate UHN thinks you're trouble. That's the way they fire people at UHN. They tell you about this. So I said, are you serious? Anyway, that was the reason. And then immediately, Barry Sherman was still alive. The drug began to be given to what turned out to be 3/4 of the population of thalassemia patients there. And I want to say that
is the blood disorder.
That's the blood disorder
Right.
under question, right? But the problem was it was being given when the drug was unlicensed. So people would say, oh, but we give off-label drugs off the term. No, it's not off-label. The drug had never been licensed. And at the time, it was not licensed at the FDA as well. So then we enter a situation, kind of a coda of the last 10 years, and David's written about this, in which patients were given this drug and they would come up to me because I was their former physician from the hospital back in 82, 85, and tell me what was happening. I was like, so we went in with a Research Ethics Board approved protocol and detailed that 65% of them had elevations in liver dysfunction and 7 new diabetics had appeared. And there was a lot of problems with this drug. And we published that and we went to the UHN and we still do not have that problem resolved. I think, I've never been able to disprove this, that drug was given without informed consent. There was never a clinical trial that I'm aware of, even though I've dug for ages to try to find that out. So in a way, the problem just shifted from the sick kids to across the street at the University Health Network.
So I want to bring in David here to maybe pan out again. And what does the story that Nancy has just told us illustrate more broadly about pharmaceutical safety?
What it illustrates is this, that a lot of people think regulators like Health Canada and FDA are looking after us. They're not. The people that look after us are doctors like Nancy, and there's very few of them. There's fewer and fewer of them doing so. So we're really ending up in a particularly dangerous situation, I think, if there's an increasing proportion of the drugs we're using that are ineffective, are less effective than older, better drugs, and more dangerous than the older drugs. And one of the things that's happening is that 30, 40 years ago, when thalidomide came on the market first, well, even earlier, but up to about 30, 40 years ago, when a drug came on the market and had problems, the problems were picked up within a year or two of the drug being on the market. Now, the problem is when drugs come on the market since about the 1980s or so, it can be 30 or 40 years before the problems of these drugs are recognized. So the situation we're in as regards the safety of drugs is much worse now than it was 40 or 50 years ago.
And that point that you just made is actually interesting, isn't it? Older drugs that have lost patent are not only cheaper, but they have a longer profile, and so we have a better understanding of their safety to benefit or efficacy to benefit profile. So you think there's obviously a financial incentive to bring continuously new drugs onto market and get them out as quickly as possible.
Yes, and the other thing that the pharmaceutical companies know is this, that even if the drug is less effective than the older drug and more dangerous, because they're able to hide the data from the trials that have been done, that they're able to persuade people that this is the drug they should be using and not the older, cheaper, better drug.
So maybe bringing this back to Nancy, what lessons can maybe we extract from, I think, the journey that you went on, but also some of the points that David has just raised? Is there any hope? Can we do better by our pharmaceutical regulatory authorities?
Well, I mean, I guess there's always the potential to do better, but I hate to be inauthentic. I want to say, and I'm just adding to what David has extensively written, which is, they couldn't do this without the academics. If everybody's falling into line and saying, I think that's what you said, Barry Sherman, then of course we're never going to learn the truth about the drug. And the patina of authenticity of the university doing these trials, these people don't even know what's going into those trials. I had somebody, when I protested what they'd written, said, oh, I was second author. I said, you're still an author, for crying out loud. There is this whole thing about, well, the University of Toronto, they wouldn't happen. Well, of course it would happen. I don't think I'm alone, but I think we are rare. I mean, because you have to give up a lot. There was a huge fight, not just me, but my 4 colleagues really suffered. Yeah. And so did a lot of people. I'm sure you know David's story at the U of T, which came 2 years after mine. You just got to laugh, really. And the point is that you couldn't do this without academics. And that is the enclave that should be protecting us. That is the enclave that is, sure, we know how pharmaceutical companies work. They do what they do. But if somebody said, well, wait a minute, that's not what the data, but they don't see the data. Maybe David can join in here because I had those data. I knew exactly the birth date of every child, and I knew exactly what the liver iron was at time 36 months. So when the FDA, just to give you a little color, said, well, this is the David Healey's liver iron was X, I said, no, it wasn't. It was 12 times higher. She looks at me, she looks at my data, she looks at the data she's given, she starts shaking her head, and on the 3rd day, or maybe it was the 4th day, she said, well, I'm going to say the F word for fraud first. Okay. I said, yeah, that's what happens. Yeah. Unless you see the data. Go ahead, David.
I think I just want to draw a close there for this segment. Okay. I think we can come back and just have kind of one more round and tidy up this last essential point about being able to see the data and to comment freely about it and accurately about it. So join us on Speaking Freely. See you after the break. Welcome back to Speaking Freely. We just spoke with Professors Nancy Olivieri and David Healey, and they were telling us about the kind of tortured journey that pharmaceutical drug trials have had since thalidomide. It's not as easy a story as we might have been led to believe. But one important point, one key point that Nancy observed and was reinforced by David is that the data matters. And in this case, Alvin is an exemplar. He's someone who survived the after effects of thalidomide, and yet he's made his life an inspiration to so many. So I wanted in this last segment to focus on that more inspirational journey and how you have been an advocate for not just yourself, but a generation of thalidomide survivors, but others who have survived other aspects of perhaps medical malpractice. Can you tell us a little bit how you have managed to take your story and become an inspiration?
Well, and I really want to tip my hat, and I would do that with my foot, because in case anybody wasn't paying attention, I don't have any arms, but I want to tip my hat to Nancy and David, because they are the sharp end of the spear. They are the ones that are actually experiencing the true negativity of all of this. I've been accused, in fact, not in always a positive way, of being a poor example of the thalidomide generation because I've been so successful in my life. And I will acknowledge that. But I also want to acknowledge that the reason that I was able to do that was by the modeling that was made for me in my home. My parents were foster parents. My mom was 55, my dad was 53 when they took me in as a newborn. When I started being able to do certain things and realizing that I wasn't going anywhere, nobody else wanted, and I was called this the freak, Jack and Hilda Law kept me. But the reason I want to bring them up is because they didn't know anything about thalidomide.
Right.
So there was no discussion in our home. It was funny. Nancy was showing that Time or Life magazine article. I had that in our home, but we never talked about it.
This is the Life magazine that profiled the story of Frances Kelsey.
There it is, right there. Yeah. I've actually got that in my scrapbook. That's creepy. I haven't seen it for years. But the point is, we didn't dwell on the negativity. I hate to sound perfect world here, Raf, but we really did have a perfect world home. We lived in rural Saskatchewan. My mom and dad were well known in the community. My father was a mechanic and service manager. So he knew, the entire community was made up of farming. So it was a very, very rural Canadian thing. And I was literally raised by the village. So I was not ever allowed to dwell on what I didn't have. And again, that sounds very idealistic, but that is what's driven me my entire life. And as a speaker now, the reason that I try to focus on the positive isn't to ignore the negative. It's not something that I do easily either, because I can get caught in the trap too of seeing how bad the world can be. But I can't allow that to run my life, because the bottom line to all of this, aside from the physical health that we're talking about today, is the more important element, and that's mental health. And I think that's where I've been able to be very proud of what I've done. Yes, inspire others, but more than anything, remind people that being angry about something is absolutely acceptable and allowed. But for me personally, it's never been in my game plan.
I think that's a very nice way of putting it. You're not denying the pain and harm that this drug caused so many, and you're right to put the kind of story on the mothers and the parents as well as the survivors. I think that's a really well thought through observation. And you talked about the sharp end of the spear. It's true that Frances Oldham Kelsey is now seen as a heroine. She was given the Presidential Medal of Honor by John F. Kennedy. But why he did that was because she was facing enormous pressure for having blocked this drug. She was only months on the job when she received the data from this drug company. And she said, no, this doesn't make sense to me. So, talk about heroes. I think you're a hero. I think, as you said, Nancy and David are heroes. What do you think it takes, in a person's character to sort of do something like that, to stand apart and not be afraid?
Well, I think what we've been talking about through this entire segment, and again, I want to acknowledge your other guests. We learn. These are learned people. These are academics. These are experts. These are people that have studied it, not Googled some far-fetched idea on the internet and then claimed it to be their own. That's what I admire about your other guests. And that's why Frances Kelsey was a hero. And I may add one more thing. She was a woman in a male-dominated field way back in the 1960s, which adds to the immense character she had. She was also extremely strong. And I think that is the bottom line. If we want to stand up to challenge the status quo, we must not back down, but we must be giving our knowledge with a credibility to it. There has to be, as we've talked about, research and data, but more than anything, it has to be credible. That's why all of these anecdotal stories of what we're talking about today, all the big bullying, I hear you, man. I mean, that's exactly what Grunenthal was a big bully, still are to this day. And I'm not afraid to say that because they're not going to come after a little fart like me. But they're still in existence today and have never acknowledged that they made a mistake, that they were wrong, and they've never said, we're sorry.
Yeah, well, I know Canada has said sorry to the thalidomide generation. And I think a new generation that might have forgotten your story and those of many others needed to hear this today. And so I'm really proud that you could join us. Anyone can Google you, Alvin. You've got a great website. I'm so happy that you're telling the story to a new generation of kids across this country. And I just want to commend you and encourage you to keep it up.
Well, thank you for having this show that allows that vessel to exist and sail off into a place that I hope will have a good ending to the story.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Alvin. And I want to thank my other guests, David Healey and Nancy Olivieri, for sharing their stories as well. And I think we've all learned something today, which is that mistakes from the past, if we don't want them to repeat, you have to learn from them. And you can't shy away or be afraid to discuss some of these things, as painful and as controversial and as difficult as they may be. So thanks again, Nancy, David, and Alvin, for your time. We hope this has been informative for our viewers. We just have one more segment, so join us after the break. Thank you for joining us again on Speaking Freely. We just heard from Alvin Law, who so eloquently spoke about his journey being a thalidomide survivor. And we spoke to two world-renowned experts on pharmaceutical drug trials and their safety, Doctors Nancy Olivieri and David Healey. One of the takeaways, I think, from the story of Alvin, but also Frances Oldham Kelsey and Nancy Olivieri, is that we need more than just talk about drug transparency. What we need is real transparency when it comes to approving the drugs that are prescribed to us. We have heard that drugs that are new and on patent are more lucrative to drug manufacturers than older, off-patent drugs. Yet, these older drugs with longer safety profiles can sometimes not just be as effective, but more effective, and more importantly, safer for the public at large. In Canada, in 2016, there was something called Vanessa's Law. It was named after an MP's daughter that had died as a result of an adverse event with a new drug. This law was meant to allow Canadians with more access to information about drug trial data and safety. What happened to that law? Has it made a difference? Turns out, not really. Health Canada still does not have access to drug trial participants, nor does the public have access to that data. Meaning, in many cases, we are relying on the companies themselves, the ones that stand to profit from drug trial approvals, to position the data in the most favorable way possible. Government regulators currently do evaluate both published and non-published data, but only in confidence with the drug manufacturers. This is a model that has proven deeply flawed, according to independent experts and doctors like Dr. Healey and Dr. Olivieri, as well as others. This may seem like a stretch, but when two Boeing 767 MAX planes went down, we finally found out about the extent of the risks that were known by the manufacturer about its new product. Now, those two crashes killed 346 innocent people. My impression is that whether it is evidence of heart attack risks with pain relief drugs like Vioxx in the late 90s and early 2000s, or with studies of children and teenagers who were given the antidepressant Paxil, time and time again, patients have been exposed to risks that are on a far greater scale than even those seen in the Boeing disasters. Question, is there a solution to the state of affairs? I think so. Not forgetting and asking for transparency from our regulators and the companies that want these drugs approved for us. Now, many younger viewers were perhaps unfamiliar with the thalidomide scandal that we talked about today. In the 1960s, it was a pill that was introduced for pregnant mothers to deal with morning sickness. It was promoted by its German manufacturer, Grunenthal, as completely safe for pregnant mothers. They even said it was safer than Alka-Seltzer. Yet in Germany alone, between 1957 and 1962, 10,000 babies were born without limbs because of that drug. How was this allowed to happen? Well, the drug company kept rebranding the drug under different names and releasing it in new countries. Spain, for example, was still prescribing thalidomide until the early 1980s. At its peak, 50 countries worldwide were giving thalidomide to pregnant mothers. What can we learn from all this? I think one of the major lessons here is that individual agency and individual people can make a real difference. Good people in key roles at key times can become heroes that save others. We shouldn't forget that, nor should we not forget the names of Dr. Nancy Olivieri, Frances Oldham Kelsey, two Canadian heroes who fought for their patients and who stood up to very powerful interests on their behalf. We should recognize their conscience and character. And we can't forget the story of Alvin, who is an example of what the human spirit is capable of. And we need to remember that drugs are powerful and therefore need to be scrutinized carefully before they're allowed to be prescribed to patients. Thank you for joining us on Speaking Freely. We hope you enjoyed today's program. Goodbye for now.